Up next, a discussion on former National Security Advisor and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. Harper's Magazine recently published 2 articles by Christopher Hitchens accusing Mr. Kissinger of international crimes. Participants at today's National Press Club event included Kissinger staff member Roger Morris, 3 law professors, and Mr. Hitchens. Harper's editor Louis Lapham served as moderator. It's about an hour and a half.
Okay, my name is Louis Lapham. This is a discussion of a 2-part essay appearing in the February and March issue of Harper's Magazine, making the case against Henry Kissinger's record, and written by Christopher Hitchens, who is an author, a columnist for The Nation, author of many books, TV shows, and so on. And we also have Scott Armstrong, another well-known author, formerly the director of the National Security Archive, Stanley Cutler, well-known professor of American history in Wisconsin, the author of many books, most recently of the Nixon tapes and the abuse of power. Roger Morris, who is formerly on the National Security Council with Nixon, again, the author of many books, and most recently I think he's writing one about Las Vegas, if that's correct. Alfred Rubin is the professor of international law at the Fletcher School of Diplomacy in Tufts University, is himself an author of several books, an authority on the old British Empire, is that correct? I think. And the subtext of the discussion this morning is, are we an empire or a democracy? Is there a way, can we behave in the manner of the old Roman Empire and do as we please with the world, drop bombs on people we feel to be communist or seditious in one form or another, or people to be well rid of? In other words, can we behave in an autocratic manner without accountability? That is the record of Mr. Kissinger's career as National Security Advisor and as Secretary of State. Were he a private citizen living in a democracy, he could be brought to justice, conceivably hanged. As a statesman operating under the droit de seigneur of senior statesman, a servant of the American Empire, under the rubric of the Cold War, he escapes all, not censure, but any kind of act of bringing him to account. The piece, the 2 essays written by Christopher in Harper's Magazine present the record of Mr. Kissinger and then raise the question, is it possible to hold such a man accountable? And at the same time, it is raising the question of what kind of country do we think we live in, do we wish to live in? And so, Christopher, you can begin with a brief précis, and then we will work it down the table, starting with Scott and going to Stanley, getting into the questions also of information, what kind of historical record are we making, and does Mr. Kissinger have the right to simply take away from the public domain those records that he feels are too sensitive to be exposed to the American public? And then we will come to Professor Rubin and to Roger Morris. And I hope that we have an audience that is will aggressively ask questions. I would like the various people on the panel to talk for maybe 45 minutes, and then we will open the conversation to questions from the audience, and then I hope that you will address them, your questions, to a specific panelist. and maybe we will have an illuminating morning. You can begin, Christopher.
Thank you, Louis. Well, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. I'm acutely conscious of, in the first place, having already had my say, so to speak, at some length, and acutely conscious also of being the only one who stands between you and people who have greater expertise than myself. But I thought I would offer you a play on some recent words which you may have been made to memorize. These words are a peaceful, orderly, democratic transition. You may have heard these words recently uttered in a self-congratulatory, not to say self-regarding manner. You may have had the opportunity to tire of hearing the words peaceful, orderly, democratic transition. You may have wondered why you are so often assured that the great distinction of the United States is that that is what it does or has or can boast of. You may even think it's slightly sinister that you keep on being told that you have a peaceful, democratic, orderly transition tradition. You may wonder even why, if it was so obvious, it had to be restated so often. So I'll stop saying it myself, hoping I've made my play on words point, and direct your attention to two elements only of my folio on Mr. Kissinger. The first being the election of 1968 in these United States. If I can make a claim to, not to originality perhaps, but to a certain synthesis in what I've written, it would be this. I think I can say that Harper's has published for the first time the summa of all the available evidence of how that election was undermined, distorted, fixed by a most appalling piece of cynicism by Richard Nixon and others, in the course of which they went to a foreign military dictatorship, negotiated secretly with that dictatorship to undermine the negotiating position of the American government, the United States government, and its legal and visible negotiators in Paris, made an illegal pact and an amoral pact that this foreign military dictatorship would get a better deal from an incoming Republican administration, and in making this pact took out what one might describe euphemistically as a mortgage or lease on another 4 years of an already proven immoral and atrocious war. The combination of the subversion of that election and the extension of that war as the price of the bargain qualified, I think, to be termed, without any overstatement, the single wickedest act in the history of this republic. And it may be doubted whether it quite qualifies under the tradition of a democratic, peaceful, and orderly transition. Certainly of the four people who concerted that policy, Richard Nixon, Attorney General John Mitchell, Vice President Spiro Agnew, and Henry Kissinger, only one has escaped any kind of indictment so far. John Mitchell was the first Attorney General to go to jail. Richard Nixon had to accept a pardon in order to avoid indictment and impeachment, and Spiro Agnew had to cop a plea also. There's only one unindicted co-conspirator still on the loose. I suggest that's a reproach to a country that considers itself to be bound by law and bound by justice. Democratic, peaceful, orderly transition was also the great boast, and rightly so, of the people of Chile, our southern neighbor, a country that has never offended or threatened to offend or had the capacity to offend or threaten the United States. It was distinguished among its hemispheric neighbors precisely by the fact that when its people had voted, their choice formed the next government, and the armed forces or the police or the oligarchy didn't determine that and couldn't intervene in it. And that will remain the state of affairs until 1970, when it was coldly decided at a meeting in Washington held, among others, by Dr. Kissinger, that there was to be no peaceful, democratic, orderly transition in Chile, that the 60-day constitutionally mandated waiting period between the election of a president, in this case Salvador Allende, and his confirmation, inauguration, would be used for a campaign of murder and subversion in order that that transition not occur. And this involved the cold-blooded planning of the murder of General René Schneider, the head of the Chilean armed forces, an honorable conservative and constitutionalist officer in a country which, I repeat, was a democracy, that had open diplomatic relations and trade relations with the United States and posed no threat to it. And that murder is now what a lawyer, I think, could decently call a lay-down case. A lay-down case from soup to nuts. We know who commissioned it, who paid for it, who organized it, who shipped the illegal money, who shipped the dirty weapons to Chile to have this done, and who paid the murderers after the crime had been committed. And the same name and the same face recurs throughout. We charge Henry Kissinger with murder for that, and we say that a society that tolerates him is tolerating that too. And that's therefore a big reproach to a society that claims to be bound by law and responsive to justice. And it's of course an utter cynical negation of all the claims that have been made about democratic, peaceful, orderly transition. As I said, of the 4 people who conducted the election subversion in 1968, only 1 remains unindicted. If you now look at the international scene and see the people with whom Dr. Kissinger was in business during his tenure in office, you will find that almost all of them also are in jail in their own countries or are going there. Of Mr. Kissinger's business and political partners, Mr. Suharto, General Pinochet, General Papadopoulos in Greece, the brigadiers in Bangladesh who committed the assassination of Sheikh Mujib, and quite a number of others are in jail, I'm glad to say, tried in courts, proper courts in their own countries, and condemned to life imprisonment. Once again, the grand exception is the man who made their political careers or military careers possible, and he dwells as an honored citizen among us, and we say, too, that that is a reproach to any society that considers itself internationally law-bound or responsive to the claims of justice on the international scale. So let that be my opening bid, and let me accept counteroffers from, or enlargements, or
a very strong bid,
undercuts from
Christopher.
These distinguished gentlemen. Thank you.
Scott?
Christopher, I'm not sure this is directly responsive to your bid, but I think I share with you and everyone here a deep concern about accountability in public service. It is a given to me that without high-quality public servants, we will not have even the mere bones of government that we now have. I encourage people that I meet, young people, to go into government. I encourage them to get the experience. I encourage them to persevere. I've even been known to congratulate senior officials on their departure from government, usually for what they don't do, and usually a catalog that I can relay to them about their failure to act in a way that was suggested that would have been worse than what they did. And I find often that they're surprised to be thanked, that they rarely are thanked except by the corporate interests that they're expected to represent. The difficulty of accountability, it seems to me, is that if we don't have an accountability for the past, we will not have people willing to serve in the future. We must make some arrangements and document them that will allow, I think, the debate that we'll have here today to be more clearly focused on individual service. It is a dangerous, violent world out there. We're often told that what public official can avoid regional conflicts, ethnic cleansing, the difficulties and harsh realities that national security decision-making, as it's put forward, is by every administration, which generally seems to me to mean arguments to protect American interests that are not necessarily the interests of the American people, except by virtue of their investment in a corporate society. And these difficulties with dealing with a political leadership that is elected to protect these interests is most dramatically presented in Kissinger's case. There is an adage that I'm afraid we are likely to invert. The adage is to make the punishment fit the crime, and I think now we sometimes are in danger of making the crime fit the punishment. Mr. Kissinger is in the parlance of street protest in the 60s, is already known as a war criminal. we're prepared to punish him as such. Now we find ourselves ordering our facts in order to construct the crimes for which we are already prepared to punish him. I have some caution about this. These are not unique actions. They were not covert. They are not Oliver North type government out of control. These, in fact, were very singular in their arrogance. They were openly contemptuous of many constitutional niceties. And Henry Kissinger and those about him were very much in control. These were deliberate manipulations of the levers of power. And it is very much that Henry Kissinger was in the loop. He defined the loop. And Christopher's indictment, if I can call it that, is of an entire administration, stretched by the Nixon resignation into 2 administrations. And those who served with him, above him, across the Potomac, and even in Congress, bear similar measures of responsibility. So what are we to do if we are not just to throw the term war criminal around loosely? We must dig out, analyze, and order the facts, the documentary record, and the forensic explanations that are offered by Mr. Kissinger, by Mr. Nixon, and by virtually every other member of that administration. It is in the bureaucratic context that we find this most interesting, and Henry Kissinger has done something quite remarkable. He's taken the most important of his papers, and he has hidden them in plain sight. He has installed them in the Library of Congress under a deed which makes them inaccessible until the year 2001 or 5 years after his death, and which means no matter how tragic his life may be this year, we're not going to be looking at those for another 5 years. They include authentic telephone transcripts of virtually every important meeting he had. The case that in which this was litigated, the appropriateness of taking government records and putting them into the Library of Congress, is Kissinger against the Reporters Committee. The other plaintiffs were the Military Audit Project and one William Safire of the New York Times. By an unusual majority that actually only had, depending on how you read the opinions, 4 members. It included 2 concurrences and a partial concurrence. And 2 abstentions. We have established a rule of law that allows one to put one's papers out of the reach of the public. General Haig did this. Caspar Weinberger did this. In fact, Caspar Weinberger did it and was indicted for it before he was pardoned by President Bush, because it was seen as an act of deliberate attempt to obstruct justice. The difficulty we now have is that there is an ongoing investigation of General Pinochet. The FBI has been pursuing this more actively than has been publicly reported, but even public reports acknowledge that there's now enough information to indict in the United States General Pinochet. However, the best evidence is evidence that's in the Library of Congress. The FBI is getting that evidence and is getting some access to it, but it has to negotiate with Henry Kissinger's lawyers. These are government records that the United States government in a criminal investigation is negotiating access to. There are a variety of things that Kissinger has done that we will find, I think, elucidated by these materials. But the most important aspect is that his staff and he have had complete access to this material. And with a very carefully selected and shaped account, Henry Kissinger has put himself beyond the control of his history, beyond the memory of those who might refute it. It will be very unlikely that in 5 years this material will be accessible. The Library of Congress has conspired to some degree to support this. What are we to do now? How do we approach this? I don't think there are simple answers. We'll hear, I'm sure, in a minute about crimes against humanity and international prosecutions. My concerns are much more American law and the ability to get some sort of truth and reconciliation process. Henry Kissinger's defense, which was quite deliberately articulated just the other night in McNeil Lair, was that much of this was done in the name of the Cold War. And in the Cold, he said, we may have been wrong, but we genuinely believed that we had to do something about Chile and other places to prevent communist takeovers. Well, I think it's time that we understood what the range of those activities were. Christopher's laid them out quite clearly. One of the more interesting rebuttals to the notion that there should be international accountability was given by John Bolton, one of the people from the Reagan administration with such responsibilities, who testified in this administration that this would not be an adequate deterrence to the activities of dictators like Pol Pot or Saddam Hussein, that an international court of criminal justice would not deter them. And yet, I remember sitting and listening to John Deutsch explain that he was very disturbed that the records of a Central Intelligence Agency director before him might be released after 40 years. And his remark was, imagine if those were released. If I knew that those were going to be released, it would change the way I treated my peers in the intelligence community from other countries. It would change my behavior. Precisely so. The notion of accountability seems to be such a shock within government, and it's one of those rare opportunities, I think, to see that the obvious lies right on the surface. And so the empirical issues of chain of command, claims of responsibility, efforts to affect the outcome, the very things that we see in government decision-making are now something that we have an opportunity and I think a responsibility to demand and to call for. Whether it's done by legislation, whether it's done by a commission, I fear a commission and who would appoint a commission, but there needs to be some mechanisms of accountability to lay out the record and complete it that Christopher's begun to describe.
Stanley?
Okay, well, Scott touched on some of the issues I wanted to mention, but reiterate a few of them. First of all, the problem with Christopher's indictment here is that Senator Helms has made it clear that he will block any treaty that would turn any American over to foreigners for war crimes trials. I suspect that Senator Helms might like to make an exception for Henry Kissinger, but not necessarily on Christopher Hitchens' grounds, but ones reflecting his own prejudices and own agenda. Let me just say a few words briefly about the work. It's quite devastating, I think. It's built on a lot of first-rate digging into primary sources. Paralleling, I would tell you, a lot of the work that's going on in the scholarly history community these days. You know, the director of the Nixon Library has always argued, just wait till all the good stuff comes out and Nixon's reputation will be rehabilitated. Well, perhaps you're not aware, but there are books, let's say now, on Nixon and the economy, Nixon and agriculture, Nixon and Vietnam, and so forth, all of you which making extensive use of the Nixon papers, which include things of Henry Kissinger as well. And I will tell you, he ain't doing so well. It's very, very clear, I think, where this historical record is going. It would take massive revisionism to turn it around, and I just don't see that in the cards. It's interesting that Christopher touched on a number of issues. There's work on that's been done on Vietnam, some on Chile, but no work on Cyprus among historians, nothing on Bangladesh, and nothing, of course, on the distinguished gentleman from Greece, Elias P. Dimitrakopoulos, of whom Christopher wrote at length, and what happened to him here. Parenthetically, I'd like to just say that when I interviewed John Mitchell a number of years ago, I asked him about Dimitrakopoulos and what he knew about that. This is the man that Christopher points out in the article, whom somebody reported was livid with Dimitrakopoulos and was going to get him and so forth. He told me he was in a very serious mood that day. That was the day that he gave me an advance peek into the notion that there was a prostitute call ring at the Democratic National Headquarters, and John Dean masterminded the whole Watergate break-in, for whom he has an audience of one, namely G. Gordon Liddy. Mitchell told me then that, I asked about Dimitrakopoulos, he said, never heard of him, didn't know him. So after, I don't have this on videotape, and it didn't show up on audio tape, when he explained to me his whole notion of Dean masterminding Watergate, I said to him, you can't be serious, and he just winked at me, but I can't record that on audio tape, unfortunately. When we talk about Kissinger's crimes and so forth, one of the things that I think that we have to remember here is that Kissinger was the National Security Advisor. He subsequently became Secretary of State. Now, he bears a great deal of responsibility that things were done, but I'm still a great believer that responsibility begins really at the very top. And if we're going to talk about Kissinger here, we're going to have to talk very, very much about Richard Nixon's culpability in all this. But as Christopher said, Richard Nixon had his comeuppance in terms of the resignation, Spiro Agnew, Mitchell. But you know, the responsibility and accountability is very widespread. Scott briefly alluded to this. What about leaders in Congress? I've always been bemused by this notion of the secret bombing of Laos that wasn't so secret. Congressional leadership knew about that. It's very interesting when they come down to the impeachment articles against Nixon that there is a proposal to impeach him on the grounds of the secret bombing of Laos. But the leadership gets that one withdrawn because they know their own culpability in that matter and their own the need for accountability to them as well. So these are not isolated acts. They permeate as, quote, policy, unquote, and as justified in the name of the Cold War. But it's on a very, very broad level. You know, lest anyone think, in case anyone has forgotten, that Kissinger and believes that Kissinger's critics are all to the left or liberals or something, I would remind you that on the right in this country, there has long been a very, very strong distrust of Henry Kissinger. There's a whole literature, I mean, this belongs in the realm of kookdom, about Kissinger being really Colonel Bohr, who was a secret Soviet agent and so forth. That I dismiss. But I don't think so dismissible is a man such as Elmo Zumwalt, who was the naval commander, of whom who gave us that unforgettable remark about the Paris peace accords. He said there are two words that characterize the Paris peace accords: that they were not, you know, it was peace with honor. He said there was the two things that stand out. It was neither peace nor honor involved in those accords. But he wrote in his memoirs, "I had first become concerned many months before the June 1972 burglary, Watergate, about the deliberate, systematic, and unfortunately extremely successful efforts of the President, Henry Kissinger, and a few subordinate members of their inner circle to conceal, sometimes by simple silence, more often by articulate deceit, their real policies about the most critical matters of national security. The President, Kissinger, and a few subordinate members of their inner circle to conceal, sometimes by simple silence, more often by articulate deceit, their real policies about the most critical matters of national security." That great leaker, Alexander Haig, didn't like them either. I've always believed that Haig had a strong part in the Joint Chiefs of Staff spying on Kissinger. Let me just turn to briefly, well, one remark about the papers. I've been aware for some time of what Kissinger and Haig and later Weinberger got away with by depositing their papers in the LC. You understand that, first of all, the Congress was able to get most of the Nixon stuff sealed off and kept from people. We have extensive files from Haldeman, Ehrlichman, John Dean, and others in the Nixon administration, but we don't have very much extensive on Kissinger and extraordinarily little about Alexander Haig. Well, you know, as Scott told you, they put their papers in the Library of Congress, papers that were generated under their duties as public servants, got the government of the United States to pay for the cost of processing and warehousing those materials. Processing those materials, I can assure you, is a very, very expensive proposition. And there they sit in the Library of Congress. Henry Kissinger and his aides have absolute access to them. Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig have made millions of dollars off their memoirs. And in pursuit of scholarly or of historical truth, we are forbidden to use them. Now, I've always regretted that the Reporters Committee failed to liberate those materials. They might try my lawyer sometime, and they might have a little better success in terms of getting that loose. I mean, I think the agreement is perfectly legal, as it turns out. I mean, I've gone through this with one of my former students. Is on the is pretty high up there in the manuscript division, and he's persuaded me that you know, there's not much you can do about this now. But if Kissinger is really interested in defending himself, well, how about putting it all out on the record and let us see it? Now, I want to say one final, in conclusion, I want to say a word about Vietnam policy. I mean, I think of all these subjects, this is the one that still has the greatest allure to us. It's still an extraordinarily seductive question. There's been some wonderful work done on this subject. There's an interesting book by a young man named Jeff Kimball on Nixon in Vietnam. There's a forthcoming book this summer by Larry Berman on Kissinger and Vietnam. And Mr. Berman has had access, the heart of his new material is he's had access to the transcripts of the negotiations between Kissinger and Le Duc Tho. And you might find Le Duc Tho's a frustration and anger with Kissinger to make him a rather attractive character.
How does he get access without?
Well, I just don't know exactly, but they're there. They're quotes. I haven't read the footnotes that extensively yet. I just got the manuscript. But what is clear now to us is, despite the talk in 1968, I mean, it's very vague by Nixon about doing something to end the war. Well into the end, to late 1970, Kissinger and Nixon are convinced they can win that war. They can win that war. But by late 1970, Nixon becomes concerned because of the domestic situation in the United States. Yet he's got this hang-up about honor. I don't want to be the first president to lose the war. I thought James Madison was the first one to lose a war. Suddenly he's concerned about that kind of reputation. He talks in late 70 with Kissinger about withdrawing all remaining U.S. ground forces except those who could be considered residual. I'm not sure. By pressure on Hanoi by canceling negotiations, issuing an ultimatum, and massively bombing, mining, and blockading North Vietnam. Now, Kissinger argued against that policy. He considered it a kind of bug out, meaning that a pullout by the end of 1971 would leave them incapable of dealing with setbacks in South Vietnam when the 1972 presidential election would take place. It would be better, therefore, he said, to continue with negotiations, which on a certain level were a sham, and extend the timing of troop withdrawals until the end of 1972, and I must quote him precisely here from one of the tape transcripts, so that we won't have to deliver finally until after the elections. Yeah, peace was at hand after the elections. That's the point. Now, is that indictable by his own words? It's not very good for his historical reputation, that's for sure.
Professor Rubin.
I'm tempted to respond to everybody, but I'm not going to. Instead, I'm going to just give some legal outlines. I might mention, by the way, I knew Bud Zumwalt 35 years ago and haven't seen him since. First of all, the U.S. Constitution does not give authority to the Secretary of State. It gives authority to the President, to the Congress, and to the courts. The remedy for evil is therefore impeachment, and impeachment applies not only to presidents, but it can also apply to congressmen and to members of the court. Non-re-election. Another remedy in the moral sphere, and one that's probably essential, is exposure, and that's a responsibility of the press. A responsibility, I'm afraid, that the press has not borne terribly well, with the exception, I suppose, of Christopher and some others. If it's not applied, if the remedies that are available are not applied, society is weakened. We have, for example, a failure to pay our UN dues. There's a positive law obligation. There's no question that we owe over $1 billion in dues. Now the press has been talking about Senator Helms being willing to approve something over $500,000, as if that were a great achievement. We owe over $1 billion. Now, $500 million is not $1 billion. At the same time, we argue that the UN should pursue various activities that it cannot pursue without money. We argued in the advisory opinion before the International Court of Justice many years ago that France and Russia owed money for a peacekeeping operation in the Congo. I happened to have been in government at the time and said we shouldn't be doing this because it might come back against us. Well, by golly, it has come back against us, and everybody's forgotten the argument made in the earlier case, except everybody outside the United States. The press has certainly forgotten, and I think you've failed in your job, because I'm speaking of public records now. There are similar things that go on today. The NATO operation in Kosovo, for example, is viewed as an illegal operation by the United Nations. There's no secret about that. The operation was clearly illegal under the UN Charter. The UN Charter is a treaty. It's a positive law obligation of the United States. We have done nothing in the press to publicize the illegality of that operation. The result has been not a successful operation, but the handing of Kosovo over to a group of people who have difficulty administering the country. Atrocities against Serbs, as there have been Serbian atrocities against Kosovar Albanians. And frankly, in my own experience, atrocities are not limited to one side or another. There are right-wing nuts on all sides, and there are left-wing nuts, and there are a lot of innocent folks in the middle who get hurt by both sides. Secondly, international law does not involve personal crimes. I know that a lot of international lawyers disagree with that statement. I'm prepared to take them all on. I have in a number of articles. There is simply no, I repeat, no evidence in the usual logic of international lawyers to support the notion of an international criminal court, other than the positive law document concluded in Rome in 1998. Victor's justice, like in Nuremberg, applied our version of international law to the defeated enemy. It did not apply our version of international law to our own people who admitted war crimes. There are documented evidence of this. For example, a note was passed to the court during the trial of Admiral Dönitz, saying it was a war crime for him personally to be involved in the unrestricted submarine warfare decree that Germany had made. Admiral Nimitz submitted a letter saying under orders from Washington he had issued an identical decree on December 7th, 1941. As far as I know, Admiral Nimitz has never been tried for the crime for which Dönitz was convicted. In fact, he was never even hailed before a domestic tribunal. In fact, if I remember correctly, he was given a ticker tape parade. The notion that an international criminal court will work, therefore, assumes that we are prepared to have our people tried for the same things that we say others violate international law by doing. It has never, never happened except in Victor's justice courts. Never. And I repeat, never. There are all sorts of reciprocal operations about which we purport to get upset from time to time. For example, in the last election, there was a big fuss made about Chinese paying the Democratic Party for helping support its campaign. And yet I saw not a mention in the press of the things that Christopher talks about, the United States, paying various folks in Greece, Portugal, elsewhere, Indonesia, for to affect their local elections. Obviously, the things that we do come back to haunt us. We fuss about them when they're against the perceived interests of those who are fussing. We do not fuss about them when those people sort of neglect the rules of reciprocity. Thirdly, I would emphasize that immorality is not illegality, and illegality is not personal criminal liability. As a matter of, first of all, the word justice is not a word in the legal order, it's a word in the moral order. Aristotle wrote a book about it, actually, the Nicomachean Ethics. Ethics is the Greek word that's equivalent to mores in Latin, which is frequently translated practices or justice, morality. Aristotle wrote that there are at least 3 different kinds of justice: commutative justice, distributive justice, rectificatory justice. He didn't mention retributive justice. There are many other categories of justice. There are probably a dozen or more. But when we speak of justice, therefore, it behooves us to understand what we're talking about. Some people will never be satisfied that justice is done until the world is emptied of everybody but themselves and their family or their tribe. Otherwise, everything is self-defense, including the actions by the United States in Vietnam and elsewhere, including the actions by Vietnamese or bin Laden against the United States. These are regarded as divine law decrees in the interest of justice as defined by the people who blasphemously attribute to God their own interpretations. I say it's blasphemous because by all religions that I know of, including the Muslim religion, it is blasphemous to presume to know the will of God. And yet we're surrounded with people who know that will, who claim to know that will. I might say before going on, one of the notions I tell my students right away is I know I'm fallible because I'm a younger brother. I knew when I was 3 years old that my big brother, who was 6 years old, was infallible, and he made it quite clear that I was fallible. From that lesson, this evolves over time, of course. When you're 14, your parents become fallible, and you become infallible. By the time you're 20, they've learned a great deal. In any event, from this flow two corollaries. One, if I'm fallible, it's likely that you are too. I don't know that you are, but it's likely. Second, assuming that you can convince me that you're infallible, I might be wrong because I'm fallible. Therefore, I would never accept the word of Jerry Falwell or Henry Kissinger or anybody else as to anything, whether or not I can check the primary sources, because I'm fallible. The moral remedy, therefore, for these moral delicts, for the lack of perceived justice, is not a criminal trial. The moral remedy is shunning somebody. It's exposure. Exposure has been the role of the press, the media in the United States. It has failed. Mr. Kissinger is getting, as I understand it, about $30,000 per speech. Who's paying him? Has there been no fuss about the people who are paying him? Why is there not an outcry of those whose moral level is so poor that they pay Kissinger $30,000 for an appearance? Other remedies are truth and reconciliation commissions. There's been no talk in the United States that I know of a truth commission. Exposure is the job of the press. I would argue that to conceal the primary evidence in the Library of Congress or elsewhere is not only legal, but in criminal actions in the United States, we have a privilege against self-incrimination. It seems to me that that privilege in self-incrimination indicates, among other things, a weakness of applying criminal law remedies, even domestic criminal law remedies where they might exist, to these matters. These are political faults. These are things that demand exposure. If democracy is to work, they must be exposed. They are not being fully exposed until Christopher began his articles, except in the extreme left-wing press that nobody reads. And it seems to me that there are remedies available, and I wish people would go to them more often. Thank you.
Roger.
I suppose I have the dubious distinction here of being the only member of the panel who has actually worked for a war criminal. I wanted to respond just very briefly to some of the comments that were made earlier. Christopher's quite right, I think, that the collusion with the South Vietnamese regime prior to Mr. Nixon's first election was a great constitutional crime. There is, of course, no enduring honor among constitutional scoundrels. Within 3 months, I know personally, Christopher, the United States government was contemplating the assassination of General Tew because he proved to be rather, as you know, recalcitrant from time to time about American diplomacy and policy in Vietnam. So the collusion, the cooperation, the collaboration, including covert money from the South Vietnamese as well as from the Greek junta and others, was a very short duration. There was indeed a serious effort, Stanley, in the early days of the Nixon administration to to negotiate a peace in Vietnam. Tony Lake and I were personally involved, working for Kissinger in the first covert peace talks. Covert in the sense that they were unknown even to the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense, anyone else outside the White House in Paris. We took elaborate precautions to avoid surveillance, not by the Soviets or the Chinese or any other power, but by the American government to conduct those negotiations. And there was on the table in the early spring of 1970 a negotiated withdrawal of all American forces by the end of the year, by the end of 1970. That was interrupted by the dementia, not alas, of Henry Kissinger, but of the man he worked for, Richard Nixon, and the ensuing Cambodian invasion. And you know the sequel. Several thousand Americans died in the years that followed, and several 100,000 Southeast Asians died, of course, as a result. I wanted to say, too, Stanley, that if these transcripts are revealing, please be cautious. One of my assignments, as it was also Tony Lake's, after each of the sessions in Paris with Le Ducteau, was to doctor the transcripts so that Henry would look good for posterity. There was a deliberate and conscious and very elaborate falsification of the record, including the insertion sometimes of humorous and erudite remarks that had not in fact been made at the table, but which I think would serve historians well when they came to judge Henry's statesmanship as well as his humor, which of course was, I think, almost as important as his diplomatic achievements. I remember quite vividly, in fact, spending a good deal of time writing speeches and trying to confect jokes for appearances in this very building, in which he was, as you must remember, the darling of the American press. This war criminal we now meet to excoriate and to expose was the preeminent celebrity of the Nixon years. Not only because he was successful and not only because he was charming at briefings, but because he trafficked in that most wonderful of all Washington commodities, the selective leak. He was the greatest leaker, I think, in the history of American politics, foreign or domestic, and it was not by accident that he was appreciated by those to whom he leaked. He made careers possible, salaries larger, and reputations, I suspect, more enduring. We shall not know all of his transgressions in foreign policy ever, I suspect, and we shall never know his machinations with the Washington Press Corps or on the Hill, which were equally, believe me, equally impressive. He spent most of his time cultivating that audience, not plotting against Allende or propagating genocide in Bangladesh, but making sure that Joe Kraft and the Times and the Post and all the others were well fed and nourished. I must say that in a final comment about my colleagues here, it's quite true that John Mitchell and Richard Nixon and others were held accountable in some way, but my goodness, we must remember no American political figure has ever gone to jail for an act of foreign policy of any dimension. Richard Nixon was not driven from office because he bombed Cambodia. He violated other canons of the elite, but it was not the savaging of a country from 30,000 feet with other impunity. It really involved other crimes, other transgressions. John Mitchell did not go to jail. Haldeman did not go to jail. Ehrlichman did not go to jail for acts of foreign policy in which, of course, they were all complicit. That brings me to just two or three brief remarks about Christopher's absolutely wonderful work, and I agree with Alfred. Exposure is everything. We haven't begun to have it yet in America in either domestic or foreign policy. We are really still very much in the dark. I would just remind you that though Henry Kissinger's culpability is quite clear, he was never alone. He could not have conducted this savage, heedless, criminal foreign policy by himself. He was surrounded by Kissinger's Kissingers, and they were men who profited personally, materially, in career terms, in terms of reputation, in terms of power, almost as much as he. Only a few of the names you know: Alexander Haig. I mean, we have here a catalog of future secretaries of state, Alexander Haig and Larry Eagleburger, and future national security advisors, Brent Scowcroft. The list goes on. You must understand, of course, that their protégés populate the new administration. There is a direct genealogical line between Henry Kissinger and the national security apparatus, as it were, of George W. Bush. Henry's transgressions would not have been possible without the active intellectual and substantive support of his aides. Ed Corey was an old journalist who had been burned in career terms in Eastern Europe after World War II. He was haunted by the communist menace. His cables from Santiago, his characterization of Allende and his regime, his portrayal of that election campaign had a great deal to do with the mania that then overtook the White House. And Henry's orders did not go into the ether. They were executed and carried out and supported and often enthusiastically backed by an entire bureaucracy in the Department of State and the Central Intelligence Agency and the Pentagon. Please don't assume that war criminals are lone rangers, despite Henry's characterization of himself as that to Oriana Fallaci on one occasion. He was never a lone ranger. He was the commandant of a willing and eager army. And they are men who have equally escaped any accountability, even the kind of exposure we're trying to give Kissinger here today. And they all went on, not only to new power, but to wonderful lives of respect and sinecure and pensions and academic postings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Henry's not the only one who is honored by our culture. His men were as well, and many of them are still alive. I must just say that this strikes me as very encouraging that you have come in such numbers this morning. I'm not generally optimistic about the issue of accountability in American foreign policy. I think there is no area, to paraphrase one of Lewis's wonderful books, there is no area in which there is a greater wish for kings in American life than in the conduct of our foreign relations. Henry Kissinger reflected then, as I think his successors have reflected, the overwhelming urges and prejudices of the American people. The racism that was reflected in our policy in Southeast Asia was a racism deeply embedded in American society. Henry was not an aberration. He was a kid from George Washington High in the Bronx, and I need not remind you, Harvard. And he reflected the values and the inner ethic, the often unspoken inner ethic of our most revered institutions. He got away with it not because he was some sly magician or some skillful manipulator. He got away with it because he reflected so often what so many of his peers, those above and below and around him, felt in the press, in Congress, in the executive branch, in the bureaucracy, in the political world, in the intellectual world, in academia. He was quintessentially, in his savagery toward the outside world, his heedlessness, his imperial mentality, reflective of very powerful strains in American life. And we must not forget that. He was not apart from the main. Though we now single him out for responsibility, the responsibility, of course, ultimately is ours. Thanks.
Very good. Christopher, a closing word or a comment on each of the remarks, and then we can turn it over to questions.
Well, I'm just delighted that the other panelists have so much materialized the way in which, how should we put it, Harper's plays for very high stakes. We're not just talking about justice, in other words, today, ladies and gentlemen, but also about freedom of information and the historical record. So these are not minor potatoes. And therefore, in seeking to clarify a case against a successful example of the criminal type in politics, and to say that that's a reproach to what we think of as the prevailing standards, we also demand that the record become open and that the historical record be inspected, because it belongs to us. It's been annexed. Chunks of it have been sawn off and made into private property and converted for private use, with appalling distortions. I'll give you one example only. The word Timor, T-I-M-O-R, significant of a country in Asia, a whole country and whole society and culture, utterly devastated by Henry Kissinger's attentions, does not appear in his own memoirs, out of which he's made a fortune, and which he qualified himself to write by having been Secretary of State. But it's up to him what is going to be included in that record or not. This is a fantastic abuse, not just of the free information process, but also of the historical record itself, and demands redress. Now, I'm also very glad that Roger turned the fire a little on my own profession. It's appalling to me that Henry Kissinger should appear in the mass media not as, I don't insist he appears in an orange jumpsuit at all times, though, well, I'll step lightly over that, but more often as an independent and objective commentator than as a subject of scrutiny. In other words, his opinion and advice are sought as if they were neutral by people like Ted Koppel and by people like Jim Lehrer and so on, by the Los Angeles Times op-ed page and the op-ed page of our own hometown rag, the Washington Post, which had to be written to, I think, perhaps 50 times by groups of congressmen and others before it would identify Mr. Kissinger as other than a former Secretary of State, when he was writing about business relations with China, in which he had a direct interest. It took a long time to get the Washington Post to add that tagline, simply that the author of this piece has an interest in the outcome of the argument. There's a great cause for reproach, in other words, in our profession of having failed to do this. And finally, since we may as well leave no one standing while we're about it, implied in everything I've written is a rebuke to the fantastically complacent and overfed community, the American human rights set. I believe if you lived in New York or Washington and you were a member of any committee on human rights of any sort, you probably need never dine alone. Almost every night of the week, someone is giving another member of this community a human rights award for their brave work on, as it might be, Sri Lanka or the Taliban. And only the other day I saw Arya Naya, who must be the absolute czar and pope of this community, writing a long and thoughtful, ruminative piece, grazing on the lower slopes of international morality. In the New York Review of Books, the question before him was, how should we deal with the monsters of this world? What, for example, to do to bring Slobodan Milosevic to justice? And so on. And I read a page through, not a word. Within a few blocks of where he was writing this article in Midtown Manhattan sits the proper object of his attentions. And until this Caliban and mirror relationship can be brought into a finer alignment, it seems to me a mockery is made of all the customary standards by which our press and human rights and freedom of information and historical truth seminars are carried on. Well, thank you anyway. Thanks.
We have questions. We have about half an hour. I think you have to get close to a microphone if you're going to ask a question. So, and please direct the question at whichever panelist you feel best suited to answer it.
Well, I'm Al Milliken with Washington Independent Writers, but this would be to anyone that has followed in recent months the United States government dealing with the massacre of civilians going back to the Korean War. And has anyone see a correlation how they've been dealing with that situation?
No.
at that time as how they're dealing with what you've uncovered about Henry Kissinger and his associates?
Well, I would think Roger Morris might answer that, because that goes to what kind of a country we are. I mean, that's the question you raised, that Kissinger is not acting alone, and that...
You're alluding to the No Gun Re investigation, yes.
Let me just say, I was in the White House on the National Security Council staff when the first really serious evidence of the My Lai massacre was presented to the administration. And like all these matters, it was not viewed, I'm afraid, in moral or legal terms. It was not even viewed essentially in diplomatic terms for what it might mean in terms of the conduct of the war in Southeast Asia, but rather as a domestic political problem. And not even then as a problem involving so much the American people as the President's relationship with the American military, who even as he was contemplating what to do about this was spying on him quite actively. It's important to remember that this government is a court of the Borgias and has been for some time, and I suspect will remain so. And these are not matters that can be dealt with in camera in any responsible way. The only hope is to deal with them in the open, and that comes back to you, of course, to the press. I think the Hill is hopeless, and so the only real chance at accountability is exposure, and that's coercion. That's forcing them to do something against all of their instincts and against their will. But the handling of the Korean massacre is just exactly characteristic, it seems to me.
Lewis?
Question from here. You gentleman's about to get the microphone.
I wonder if one of you would discuss, the issue of sovereign immunity, which is really what we're talking about. So there's a subtext here, which probably needs some legal discussion and perhaps the more.
First of all,
Roger Morris, you say disclosure. We've had 20 years of exposure and disclosure about Henry Kissinger, Walter Isaacson, Seymour Hersh, the Church Committee. It hasn't made the slightest bit of difference in his reputation and his life. So would you comment on that? Why is it doesn't take?
Mary, I remember you and I tried this even when I was still working for the administration, if you'll recall. It doesn't take, I think, because it's of not sufficient shock value. I don't think we've ever really gotten close to the heart of the matter, as Christopher has gotten in these two pieces. I think there's been a lot of surface smut. But I don't think we've really put it all together the way Hitchens has in these two articles. And I think, quite frankly, that this is an incremental process. I think the education of the American people is a very slow and agonizing business, especially in foreign affairs. And we benefit in part from the trail of scandal and of disgrace and of dishonor that followed Kissinger with other politicians. We are now much more sophisticated, it seems to me, about both our domestic order and about our conduct in the world. And it doesn't seem hopeless that we would come at some point to a reckoning. So I don't count the failure of previous expose or disclosure as all that decisive. I think it is incremental, and I think we need a great deal more.
Could we have Professor Rubin on that question, because this is about exposure and this is your remedy?
Let me answer two questions then. The first, with regard to exposure, the U.S. has been notoriously two-faced about it. For example, we argued for command responsibility in the so-called Yamashita case after the Second World War, where an American military commission held Admiral Yamashita had violated international law by not controlling the troops that were notionally, at least in some distant way, under his command in Manila. But we acquitted Captain Medina after the My Lai massacre under a charge that was totally inconsistent with the earlier Yamashita case. We tend not to try our own people for doing the things that we blame others for doing. Same thing is going on in Nogunri. We understand why our people, to save their own lives, shot a lot of innocent civilians. We don't understand why the other side might shoot a lot of innocent civilians to save what they fancy to be their amour propre or whatever. As far as sovereign immunity is concerned, the American courts have been notoriously confused about it, and the reasons lie in, well, way back. You may remember in the American Journal of International Law, this was discussed in 1975 or 76 when the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act was, before it was passed. The only edition of the proceedings of the American Society in which those who spoke from the floor are not identified by name. The reason for that is fairly clear. It's not admitted by the people who were running the thing at the time. But the reason is clear. Those who spoke against the act were people like Myers McDougall of Yale, Mike Cardozo, myself. Not that that matters very much, but anyhow, there were a number of people who spoke against the act, saying it wouldn't work the way it's planned, but Monroe Lee was behind it, and he was the legal advisor, and that was that. There are two problems in sovereign immunity. First of all, sovereign immunity runs to sovereigns, that is to states, and not to individuals. The Foreign Sovereign Immunity Act, in effect, says that when the foreign sovereign acts in a commercial capacity, then he can be sued as if he's an ordinary corporation. That's fairly clear. Every corporation in the United States, after all, is the result of an act of some legislature or some executive branch submitting appropriate documents. Even if you're DuPont in Delaware, you owe your legal existence to some legal act by somebody empowered to act in that way. Therefore, all corporations in the United States are, in effect, branches of the sovereign, in that they're licensed by the sovereign to be an individual person. Whether Amtorg, the former USSR trading corporation, is the equivalent, or ICI, the British Imperial Chemical Industries, or other things, are the same category. We say that that's a matter for the U.S. courts, and they should apply a rule of whether the acts are jure gestionis, that is commercial acts, or jure imperii. And the U.S. Supreme Court has split notoriously on delicate cases. In fact, the two leading cases split, believe it or not, 3 to 1 to 1 to 4 in one of the cases, where 3 plus 1 plus 1 made the 5-man majority. So the 3-man minority wrote the majority opinion, in effect, even though only 3 concurred in it. And the other one was 4 to 1 to 4 a year later, in which the 1 made one of the 4 into 5 and was clearly absurd. It said, you know, this act is certainly a sovereign act, when it was certainly a commercial act, when in fact, had the case been tried in the country involved, there's no question that there would have been no recovery. So it was clearly a legal act, which is a sovereign act. The Supreme Court has not heard a serious sovereign immunities case other than an Argentine case where we held 9-0 that a particular act was not entitled to a sovereign immunity, a loan, which was clearly in contradiction to a Nicaraguan case holding exactly the opposite a couple of years before. Why it's got 9-0 in that particular case, I don't know. I presume that the parties had negotiated something out of court or whatever, and the newspapers never picked it up. As far as I know, therefore, the U.S. Supreme Court has never made up its mind on sovereign immunity, won't hear a case. If it does, it'll come down 5-4 or 6-3 again. Nobody will know what the proper answer is. And the result of that is that if you've got a case against a foreign sovereign, the chances are you'll settle it out of court rather than waste the money on lawyers to get a decision that is not going to be meaningful. That has to be distinguished from the choice of law situation. Once a case is before the courts, there is a question that the American courts will try to answer as to what body of law applies to govern the case. In a civil case, it's been fairly clear since 1834, since Joseph Story wrote the book on the subject, that there is a choice of law involved. There are some cases where we will apply Cuban law or Argentine law or what have you. We abandoned that in the so-called Phil Artiga case, where we applied what we called international law to the acts of a foreign individual. Now, sovereign immunity had nothing to do with the case. This was a choice of law decision, and it went, peculiarly enough, under the Alien Tort Claims provision of the Judicature Act of 1789, which, in fact, if you read it carefully, makes no sense at all. None. If you read it with any knowledge of the history, for example, noting that international law is not identical with the law of nations of 1789, noting that for 150 years after Story wrote his book, there has been no case under the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. The reasons are absolutely clear. The constitutional provision changed its meaning. International law is not the same as the law of nations. Its jus gentium is not the same as jus inter gentes, to use the Latin phrases, which therefore must be important. Therefore, I find that sovereign immunity would be no defense to Kissinger, but the choice of law problem would apply, and the question would be what law applies. Is it American law, in which case he's not guilty of anything? We're all guilty. Or is it international law, in which case it seems to me he gets off free because international law has never, except in victors' tribunals, held a person to be a criminal at international law. And I wrote a book on piracy at one time where I looked at all the piracy precedents. It's just not true, the arguments that you hear bluntly from human rights lawyers. Piracy is not the paradigmatic offense. It's a municipal law offense. Always has been, always, as far as I can see, will be.
Thank you. Before your question, Stanley, or Scott, yeah, but briefly, okay?
I just want to respond to Mary McGorry's question here. Indeed, it is a bit of a mystery how there are these critical things that are said and done about Mr. Kissinger. His reputation remains really rather high. But I would distinguish for you between your world and another world. I suppose these days we call it spin control. Roger Morris used a wonderful word before speaking of Henry Kissinger's machinations. I think that this is a full-time enterprise on his part. You remember when he was in government, there were reporters who would follow him around and made good money writing books about him and about his diplomacy. Those were books as told to by Henry Kissinger. There was no digging into sources, no wide range of anything rivaling scholarship and so forth. What's fascinating here about Hitchens' work to me is that he has done what is often not done in that world. He has looked at a multiplicity of sources. He's looked at archival primary documents. It would have been very, very easy to write about Henry Kissinger and his policies by just asking for an interview and let Henry Kissinger tell you what happened, which is what usually does result from these kinds of works. As you see, Christopher did try to interview Mr. Kissinger, but to no avail. Who knows, had he done it, maybe he could have found Christopher a little soft in the head and converted him. I doubt that, but he might have. But there's a question here of really of the responsibility of the media and the people who report these things. They want access. They want access. You don't certainly think that somebody like Ted Koppel is going to be that critical of him. He wants him on his program. He's got star appeal, so to speak. But that's what I mean. I think it's a question of preserving one's access and sources, and there's a reluctance to be critical here. There are, as you correctly pointed out, there is some criticism, but it hasn't stood much of a chance against all this other stuff.
First you, and then you. Okay.
Having plowed through this very formidable body of work, I'd like to ask Christopher if you could clarify one particular point for me on which I'm still not clear, and that is how we define and trace the precise distinction between an utterly ruthless realpolitik as carried out by great powers for many, many generations, and a personal, indictable responsibility for an act of international crime. And I'm still a little bit unclear about whether there is a border between those two in your thinking, or whether that this is, in a sense, indictment one in a whole litany of potential indictments that can then go on to include, for example, Margaret Thatcher over the sinking of the Belgrano, the late Leonid Brezhnev over Soviet behavior in Afghanistan, and so on. Are you arguing that there is something about the Kissinger record that is unique, above and beyond, and wicked, beyond the ordinary wickedness of superpowers and realpolitik?
Oh, I'm so sorry. You should have said before. Well, Mary McGrory said a few moments ago that, after all, think of how many times Kissinger has been exposed by Cy Hirsch or the Church Committee or Walter Isaacson. So, well, the Church Committee and Walter Isaacson both examined the case of General Schneider, the one with which I opened my bid today, and concluded that Kissinger hadn't had him killed. Right? A fantastic conclusion from the available evidence to them even then. They said it was a kidnap thing that went botched, probably. Absolutely not true. It's every stage of it now can be demonstrated. And now, I think it's only really with the final disclosures that arose from the Hinchy Amendment last year, which forced the CIA to disgorge fully what it had done in Chile. We've only known since, I think it's about November, of the giving of 35 grand, which is a lot of money in 1971 prices, to the people who'd killed Schneider after they'd finished the job. Okay, not the sort of sum that could be dispersed, I think, by a local station chief either. Probably involving the knowledge of someone chairing the 40 committee, I would think. But once you've established that money was paid to the murderers after the murder's been done, then all the stuff in Isaacson and the Church Commission is shown to be nonsense and a euphemism. Because once that final bit is in place, all the A words kick in: aiding, abetting, accessory, accomplice. And that's a murder case. And there's no law, as far as I know, that allows someone to say, well, it's okay, I did have this guy killed in another country, who'd never done anything to me or to anyone else, but I did it because the president told me to. If that can be entered as a defense, I would like to see it entered as a defense. Okay? But first, somebody has to say, you can't do that. Or I would just as soon hear them say, and take Professor Rubin's, I think rather pessimistic, but very forensic line on this. Very well then, let us have it said that that is legal as long as you are an American. Let's have that clarified too. What one cannot go on doing is living in this semi-opaque world of multiple standards, if standards they may be called. Now, to your question, is there anything unique about the good doctor, and would it be the case that if we went after him, we'd have to go after everyone else in history as well? I'm, for example, one of those who's completely fascinated with the question, why do most school productions of Henry V leave out the bit where Shakespeare puts in King Henry's massacre of the French prisoners at Agincourt? And should this case not be reopened, and should we now not rather view King Henry V in the light of a war criminal? I'm all for that. I love these kinds of arguments, okay? But I also have a maxim permanently in my head in these matters: don't make the best the enemy of the good, okay? In the case of Kissinger, we have someone who's still around, very much in our midst, and we have all the evidence about the crimes that he committed in a series of countries, making it look as if aberrations couldn't form a defense, say in the matter of Vietnam, or Cambodia, or Chile, or Laos, or Bangladesh, or Cyprus, or East Timor, because after a bit it stops looking like coincidence, okay? I was going to call this Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, but then I thought that might be offensive to some potential readers, so we called it a war criminal instead. But here we have such a case, here we have such a test case in the making, and here we have international law and customary law evolving somewhat with the arrest of Pinochet and the warrant for Milosevic. And we know, and I have the tape, and it's in the Harper's piece, that Mr. Kissinger is smarter than we are. He knows he could be in legal jeopardy for the Schneider business. He knows he could be the subject of an alien tort claims suit brought by Chilean relatives. He knows all this crap. He knows he has to be careful where he travels. I make a little holiday in my heart every time I hear this. He's told various associates of his he's not sure he can go to Europe anymore. Okay? He's only welcome in certain rather grungy salons in New York these days. It's not punishment enough, in my view. I think we should proceed further with it. So that's my answer to that.
Under the extradition laws of the United States, we do not have any exception for American nationals. Unlike Chile, where we said they had an obligation, or Libya, where there's no extradition treaty, the U.S. has extradition treaties with many countries, including Spain, and we do not accept American nationals from their operation. Therefore, if any Latin American, well, I don't know about Latin American countries, but if many countries in Europe would like, or elsewhere, would like to extradite Henry Kissinger, they can bring a case right now in an American court, and I'll bet you that Henry Kissinger knows all about that.
Before I'm going to ask this woman here, before I ask, before you ask the question, Martin, I would think one of the things that's unique about Kissinger is how small the stakes are. I mean, it's usually about his own career. He's prepared, as opposed to the ruthless realpolitik, which is for reasons of the state or has a larger purpose. And with most of Kissinger's actions, it's about his personal advancement. And that strikes me as fairly unique. Okay.
Another question for Christopher Hitchens, so I guess you'll have to stand up again. And I was unaudibly delayed, so you may have already answered this question.
Would you address yourself? That's right.
Okay. As you know, there's some effort now to bring Pinochet to trial, and he was released by the British, as we all know. And calls to mind Tom Hauser's book on the execution of Charles Horman, where Horman's father said that the reason why the United States wouldn't allow Chile to be blamed was because Chile would turn right around and point the finger at Kissinger or at the United States. Do you think that the release of Chile, of former President Pinochet from England, and the fact that he may be now described as unfit to stand trial is an effort to protect those in this country who, one could say, created Pinochet or certainly subsidized him? And is it also possible that Kissinger is being spared because he represents certain interests and disclosure? As you said, he could turn around and say the president gave me orders to. That's a fairly complex question, but I know you can get to the core of it.
But I think I understand the grammar of the question. For example, well, there are two things. One is Kissinger's suborning of murder in Chile helps bring to power a government in Chile which repays the United States, so to speak, if we can confuse the United States and Henry Kissinger for a second, which I admit is an obscenity, but just for the vernacular purposes, repays the United States in the same coin by letting off a car bomb a few hundred yards from here at rush hour, which kills Orlando Letelier, our late and great comrade, and his American citizen friend and driver, Ronnie Moffett. That's still illegal in the United States, by the way. You can't let off car bombs at rush hour in downtown Washington, D.C., especially not if there's an American citizen being killed. That's still, there's no law that says you can do that. And gradually, and Scott knows more about this case than anyone, we have, again, another lay-down case. We know exactly how that murder was commissioned and authored and carried out and paid for. And it leads right back to Pinochet. And it is still possible, if not probable, that a U.S. indictment will have to be made of the good general, who was Henry Kissinger's client. So it goes around, it comes around. These two skeins of investigation also do touch upon the material that he has tried to sequester in the Library of Congress. So I think he feels these threads slightly tightening around his pudgy neck, and I think that he should do so. And I was very intrigued to see the other day a statement, it was carried by the German press agency and just given to me yesterday, of a press conference in Barcelona, of some of the Chilean and Spanish magistrates who've been involved in the attempt to bring death squaddery within the reach of international law, saying that they want to proceed with the Pinochet case to extend it to Henry Kissinger. It's the logical next step, because Pinochet, as a torturer and assassin and author of disappearances and kidnaps and murders and so on, was, after all, not acting on his own, was acting as the instrument of a certain policy by a certain superpower, the threads of which ran through a certain fist. So yes, the skein is tightening a bit.
Do we have another question?
For Mr. Morris, Jesus Esquivel from the Mexican News Agency. My question is about Chile, too. It's so frustrating for Latin American journalists as myself when you go to the State Department or the White House to ask questions about the documents that have been released on the case of Mr. Pinochet and the involvement of Mr. Henry Kissinger. The answer is always, it's a matter of national security, and they don't want to put in risk that national security. My basic question to you is really a risk of the national security of the United States given names or putting or taking off those black ink over the lines of those documents, or is it just a matter of trying to defend personalities as Mr. Henry Kissinger?
I must say, in my experience, there are very, very few matters that are withheld from the American public or the Congress or from history in the redacted documents that are genuinely matters of national security. It would be hard to estimate, but I would say 90 to 95% of the secrets kept by the American government are secrets of expedience and political convenience, usually attendant on the administration in power, but sometimes the reputations of people who are still powerful, like Henry Kissinger, so that his successors would, in their own interest, of course, and as part of the club mentality that obtains here, try to prevent the release of incriminating documents. This is, as a famous governor of ours in New Mexico once said, a whole box full of Pandoras. Once you start opening this box, culpability, as I said earlier, does not stop with Henry Kissinger. The foreign policy establishment, and by a larger extension the American political establishment, has a very great stake in the maintenance of these secrets. And Henry's secrets, as Christopher begins to suggest, curl far beyond murder and mayhem and genocide and great crimes of state. They curl back to corporate and other collusions that are with us even today. Ultimately, what's at stake here is not the national security, but national profit. And a good deal of money was made. The foundation for the current oligarchy that prevails in American policy today, foreign and domestic, was laid during the Nixon years. So these are very momentous matters, but don't let anybody tell you that it's authentic national security. That's nonsense. This is self-protection, but until we change our methods of governance, you're stuck with it.
I think we have to stop. We've come to 11 o'clock. We could go a long time, but I'm grateful to the panelists. I'm grateful to Christopher. I would like and admire all the people on the panel. I'm sorry I can't hear more from them, but I'm also grateful to all of you for coming. Thank you very, very much.
Up next, a discussion on former National Security Advisor and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. Harper's Magazine recently published 2 articles by Christopher Hitchens accusing Mr. Kissinger of international crimes. Participants at today's National Press Club event included Kissinger staff member Roger Morris, 3 law professors, and Mr. Hitchens. Harper's editor Louis Lapham served as moderator. It's about an hour and a half.
Okay, my name is Louis Lapham. This is a discussion of a 2-part essay appearing in the February and March issue of Harper's Magazine, making the case against Henry Kissinger's record, and written by Christopher Hitchens, who is an author, a columnist for The Nation, author of many books, TV shows, and so on. And we also have Scott Armstrong, another well-known author, formerly the director of the National Security Archive, Stanley Cutler, well-known professor of American history in Wisconsin, the author of many books, most recently of the Nixon tapes and the abuse of power. Roger Morris, who is formerly on the National Security Council with Nixon, again, the author of many books, and most recently I think he's writing one about Las Vegas, if that's correct. Alfred Rubin is the professor of international law at the Fletcher School of Diplomacy in Tufts University, is himself an author of several books, an authority on the old British Empire, is that correct? I think. And the subtext of the discussion this morning is, are we an empire or a democracy? Is there a way, can we behave in the manner of the old Roman Empire and do as we please with the world, drop bombs on people we feel to be communist or seditious in one form or another, or people to be well rid of? In other words, can we behave in an autocratic manner without accountability? That is the record of Mr. Kissinger's career as National Security Advisor and as Secretary of State. Were he a private citizen living in a democracy, he could be brought to justice, conceivably hanged. As a statesman operating under the droit de seigneur of senior statesman, a servant of the American Empire, under the rubric of the Cold War, he escapes all, not censure, but any kind of act of bringing him to account. The piece, the 2 essays written by Christopher in Harper's Magazine present the record of Mr. Kissinger and then raise the question, is it possible to hold such a man accountable? And at the same time, it is raising the question of what kind of country do we think we live in, do we wish to live in? And so, Christopher, you can begin with a brief précis, and then we will work it down the table, starting with Scott and going to Stanley, getting into the questions also of information, what kind of historical record are we making, and does Mr. Kissinger have the right to simply take away from the public domain those records that he feels are too sensitive to be exposed to the American public? And then we will come to Professor Rubin and to Roger Morris. And I hope that we have an audience that is will aggressively ask questions. I would like the various people on the panel to talk for maybe 45 minutes, and then we will open the conversation to questions from the audience, and then I hope that you will address them, your questions, to a specific panelist. and maybe we will have an illuminating morning. You can begin, Christopher.
Thank you, Louis. Well, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. I'm acutely conscious of, in the first place, having already had my say, so to speak, at some length, and acutely conscious also of being the only one who stands between you and people who have greater expertise than myself. But I thought I would offer you a play on some recent words which you may have been made to memorize. These words are a peaceful, orderly, democratic transition. You may have heard these words recently uttered in a self-congratulatory, not to say self-regarding manner. You may have had the opportunity to tire of hearing the words peaceful, orderly, democratic transition. You may have wondered why you are so often assured that the great distinction of the United States is that that is what it does or has or can boast of. You may even think it's slightly sinister that you keep on being told that you have a peaceful, democratic, orderly transition tradition. You may wonder even why, if it was so obvious, it had to be restated so often. So I'll stop saying it myself, hoping I've made my play on words point, and direct your attention to two elements only of my folio on Mr. Kissinger. The first being the election of 1968 in these United States. If I can make a claim to, not to originality perhaps, but to a certain synthesis in what I've written, it would be this. I think I can say that Harper's has published for the first time the summa of all the available evidence of how that election was undermined, distorted, fixed by a most appalling piece of cynicism by Richard Nixon and others, in the course of which they went to a foreign military dictatorship, negotiated secretly with that dictatorship to undermine the negotiating position of the American government, the United States government, and its legal and visible negotiators in Paris, made an illegal pact and an amoral pact that this foreign military dictatorship would get a better deal from an incoming Republican administration, and in making this pact took out what one might describe euphemistically as a mortgage or lease on another 4 years of an already proven immoral and atrocious war. The combination of the subversion of that election and the extension of that war as the price of the bargain qualified, I think, to be termed, without any overstatement, the single wickedest act in the history of this republic. And it may be doubted whether it quite qualifies under the tradition of a democratic, peaceful, and orderly transition. Certainly of the four people who concerted that policy, Richard Nixon, Attorney General John Mitchell, Vice President Spiro Agnew, and Henry Kissinger, only one has escaped any kind of indictment so far. John Mitchell was the first Attorney General to go to jail. Richard Nixon had to accept a pardon in order to avoid indictment and impeachment, and Spiro Agnew had to cop a plea also. There's only one unindicted co-conspirator still on the loose. I suggest that's a reproach to a country that considers itself to be bound by law and bound by justice. Democratic, peaceful, orderly transition was also the great boast, and rightly so, of the people of Chile, our southern neighbor, a country that has never offended or threatened to offend or had the capacity to offend or threaten the United States. It was distinguished among its hemispheric neighbors precisely by the fact that when its people had voted, their choice formed the next government, and the armed forces or the police or the oligarchy didn't determine that and couldn't intervene in it. And that will remain the state of affairs until 1970, when it was coldly decided at a meeting in Washington held, among others, by Dr. Kissinger, that there was to be no peaceful, democratic, orderly transition in Chile, that the 60-day constitutionally mandated waiting period between the election of a president, in this case Salvador Allende, and his confirmation, inauguration, would be used for a campaign of murder and subversion in order that that transition not occur. And this involved the cold-blooded planning of the murder of General René Schneider, the head of the Chilean Armed Forces, an honorable conservative and constitutionalist officer in a country which, I repeat, was a democracy, that had open diplomatic relations and trade relations with the United States and posed no threat to it. And that murder is now what a lawyer, I think, could decently call a lay-down case. A lay-down case from soup to nuts. We know who commissioned it, who paid for it, who organized it, who shipped the illegal money, who shipped the dirty weapons to Chile to have this done, and who paid the murderers after the crime had been committed. And the same name and the same face recurs throughout. We charge Henry Kissinger with murder for that, and we say that a society that tolerates him is tolerating that too, and that's therefore